Welcome everybody to this session on social emotional learning. This is Doug McCall of the International School Health Network, a member of the FRESH Partnership, which has sponsored this series of sessions working on health and personal and social development education. I'm very pleased to welcome our two speakers who will take us through a very interesting overview of social emotional learning and looking at how it is an essential for both for health and social inclusion and preventing violence. David Osher is the I've got the title not in front of me, but is the CEO of the American Institutes for Research, and Elizabeth is the principal researcher for that group. Elizabeth, if you could go to the second slide, I'll just introduce the series of sessions. So today we're talking about social emotional learning, and it's one of several paradigms that's being considered by the FRESH working group. FRESH is a coalition of UN agencies, global organizations, and donor organizations, and we've been looking at the topic of health and personal and social development education. This session will be used to inform that working group as well as other global initiatives that are looking at the health and social development of children. And we're also hoping that our work will influence the monitoring of goal number 4, in particular target 4.7 of the 2030 UN Sustainable Development Goals. There is an absence of good information, good research on these kinds of paradigms. Elizabeth, next slide, please. So here's a list of the various paradigms, as we've called them. The working group is called Health Literacy, Life Skills, and Social Inclusion. And you can see that there are many paradigms or guiding frameworks that can be used to construct not only curriculum, but also the informal learning that occurs in schools, as well as the overall promotion of health and well-being within the school context. So this is one of several that we're looking at as part of this project. In this session, we're going to ask David and Elizabeth to go through their slides, and then we'll open up for discussion. As that is occurring, if you wanted to ask a question or make a comment, just to help you make that, if you just type it into the message box, which is in the lower left-hand corner, and once the presentations have been made, we'll come back and we'll look at how they can be responded to as well. We've called this series not so much webinars, but actually open web meetings, because we're very hopeful that all of us can have can share what we know and think we know, or what we need to know about these topics. So please, when the discussion opens up, please do click on your mic and say hello. We're actually a small enough group that's going to be relatively easy to do. So without further ado, Elizabeth and David.
Good morning. I think Elizabeth's going to start out. Elizabeth?
Sure. So I'm just going through just briefly what we're going to cover. We're packing a lot into more or less 60 minutes. So all of these could be an entire webinar in themselves. So we're just going to give you an overview here. So the first one, first David is going to talk about how social emotional learning is defined, why it matters for health, inclusion, and preventing violence, and also share some information on new advances in the science of learning and development that tell us more about how SEL develops and is expressed. Then we'll pause for questions and discussion just on that background information. And then we'll finish with, I'll give some information about how stakeholders may be able to collaborate to create an enabling environment for the promotion of positive SEL within the kinds of systems that I believe people in this call are working in. And then again, we'll have some more discussion. So I'm going to hand it back to David and move on to the next slide.
Okay. So good morning, everybody. And just to be clear, I'm a Institute Fellow and Vice President at AIR, and I do have the great privilege of leading a lot of work, but I am not a CEO and never want to be one. Thank you anyway, Doug.
Sorry about that. My apologies. No it's early in the morning.
No problem, but I think my CEO would want me to have said that. That's all. Okay. So social emotional, I think the thing to more, not just in the U.S., but in other places, to talk about the process by which individuals, children, youth, and
David, your audio is cutting out. Can people hear me?
Yes, yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, there's something about David's audio. I'll give him a second to
Yeah,
get it back.
If David's on Wi-Fi, that can be one of the reasons.
Yeah.
Just to share a terrible story about technology, we had a meeting.
Am I back?
Yes, you're back. Go ahead, David. He was back. Uh-oh.
David, if you're on Wi-Fi, that may be the problem. You may want to click out and come back in. That may help the connection. I'm not sure. It sounds like it is something in the data transmission from your office.
All right, we'll give him one more second, and then I can pick it up. So we're not all waiting, and then he can pick back up when he can get back on.
Okay, thanks.
David, are you there?
Yeah, I finally just got back.
Now you've got a bad echo.
Maybe Elizabeth, you and I can make sure our mics are off.
Yes, mine is.
It might be David, or you've got the mic on your computer. I think it's picking up.
Okay, that sounds better now. No.
No, still an echo.
David, if you were using a headset earlier or a mic, that may be the problem. Is your computer doesn't know that you're using the mic or the headset? Or if it's a Bluetooth headset, it might be as simple as your battery dying. Elizabeth, why don't you continue on, and David,
That's fine. Yep.
Yeah, why don't you, David, click on the X to exit the meeting, and then come back in, and we'll see if your connection is better.
Okay, I hope he heard that. Okay, so I think everybody on the call probably knows that social emotional learning really it's a process for helping children, youth, and adults develop the skills necessary for a safe and happy life. SEL, the learning part, teaches us the skills we need to be able to handle ourselves, handle our relationships with others, and do our work effectively and also ethically. And I would say also make decisions also that are effective and ethical in other parts of our life as well. There are many frameworks and approaches for SEL. In the interest of time, we're not going to go through the many different models and frameworks. But that's the core of it, is the handling yourselves, handling your relationships, being able to make good decisions, collaborate with others. It's important. SEL is increasingly being introduced into schools as a subject, which is fine. But it's important to note that it's not confined to one context, such as home or school. We all use it at work. We all use it throughout our daily lives. And we'll learn things throughout our daily lives and not just at school. SEL also is something that an individual develops in the context of relationships with others. It's not just something given to a person. And that's something we see a little bit with the idea, again, that SEL is a school curriculum, which, again, that's fine by itself, but sometimes I have an image of a teacher yelling at the kids to sit down and shut up so they can do that lesson on respect and kindness. So it really, we're increasingly understanding that this is something that SEL develops from birth through the lifespan in the context of relationships with others. And that really is where it intersects with a lot of the work that the people involved in the Fresh Partnerships do, because it's not just about school, it's about all other people in the young person's lives. There are social emotional competencies that vary in their expression, and SEL may vary in its strategies and approaches, especially based on things like cultural considerations. So there's not one way to be socially and emotionally competent. It really depends on your context, your position in that context, your age, all kinds of things. But at the core of it, it really is those essential, some people call them soft skills, some of those essential social skills that allow us to get through life well. And so we're also seeing that social and emotional competencies really are, we're increasingly understanding it's a mix of cognitive and emotional factors and not just social skills. It's not that you can just give somebody a skill and then they have it and they're done, like they've learned how to do a procedure or something. If you think about it, every 10-year-old in the world will tell you that smoking cigarettes is bad and yucky and they would never do something like that. Why would you ever do something like that? And then kids get older and other emotional factors about peer pressure, acceptance, cognitive things, other things get involved and change that decision-making process. So it's not that you can one time give that kid that skill of, resisting peer pressure or knowing that something is unhealthy and then you're finished. So these things sort of interact throughout the lifespan. This slide has all the details on there. I'm going to skip it because it's microscopic here. And then the skills and competencies also interact with beliefs, knowledge, self-identity, character, values, personality. So SEL really is not just a set of skills like we think about it in terms of like knowing how to change a light bulb. It really is a foundation for a lot of what happens in life, but it really works in context with all of these other things. And again, I will skip the tiny details. David, are you back?
I am back. I'm so sorry. I have no idea why I kept on getting bounced, but the equipment does not have the social and emotional skills that I needed. Okay, so keep on going, Elizabeth, unless you want to focus some questions so I don't slow people down.
No, we can go to the next slide.
Oh, precisely. Okay,
yep.
Great.
Okay, so I'm turning it over to you.
Okay, all right. I'm in the process right now of writing a paper on the relationship between thriving, equity, and human development. And I've just been pulling together what I already knew, but it's about these issues right now, and that we have evidence. And the evidence comes from a series of meta-analyses that were done in the North regarding not just the impacts that social and emotional learning programs can have on education, but also on issues that relate to mental wellness, mental illness, as well as the related questions that we're going to go to next. That we know that from 4 different meta-analyses that when young people participate in good social and emotional learning programs that can be done in schools but can be done in out-of-school settings as well, on the one hand, they develop a set of positive social and emotional attitudes and skills that help them be healthy, help them feel better about themselves, help them manage stress, for example, help them contribute to their ability individually to self-monitor, but to some extent as peers, particularly as adolescents, to also participate in self-monitoring of others. Social emotional learning, in the way I have thought about it, as opposed to just the teaching of specific life skills, not only may let you know what you might need to do to be healthy, like to use a condom, but actually helps give you the competencies so that you can use that knowledge when you need to, when the chemicals are rushing in your body and when you really need to be able to say, wait. It's the ability not just to use a cognitive format of thinking, looking at alternatives before you act, but to be able to stop yourself, to be able to reflect on what's affecting you, and then to be able to make the right decisions. What we also know about the consequences of social and emotional learning, this goes beyond the meta-analyses, but when people have these skills, they're better able to maintain treatment courses. And at the same time, what we do know from the 4 meta-analyses is not only do you see more pro-social behavior, but you see a reduction in antisocial behavior. You see more wellness-related behavior, and you see less illness-related behavior. Next slide, Elizabeth.
You still there, David?
Yeah.
Could I be heard?
Yep, now you are. Go ahead.
Was I heard, Elizabeth?
Go ahead. Yep, you're on. Go ahead.
Did we go through the slide or not? Because okay,
yes.
I was Maurice Elias, who teaches at Rutgers University, observed the fact that if one really wanted to create inclusive environments, one had to not only provide a set of skills to the young people who were being included, but perhaps more importantly, to provide a set of skills, both the actors would be involved in the including process as people who were facilitating that process and the peers. Good social emotional learning and emotional learning that is adapted to the strengths and needs of individuals can help young people with disabilities further self-manage themselves within a different type of context, or maybe within a context they already know, and be able to act in ways that can help them be more effectively included. If we think, for example, about a child who is in the autism, child with some learning disabilities or other emotional behavioral disorders, sometimes they tend to misread other people's behavior. Sometimes they tend to be less sensitive to how people read their behavior. And I'm just using that one example, which is not the case always. Good can help them so that they can better read the behaviors of others and that they can be differentially perceived by others. And the inclusive environment provides a better opportunity for learning those skills. At the same time, young people who may be differently abled and who may have less openness to different types of diversity can develop the skills so that they can both more appreciate their peers who are now part of their classroom, and also respond to them in a proactive manner. One element and processing is called co-regulation. It can exist between a parent and a teacher and a young person. It can also exist between peers and young people. And what can happen sometimes, particularly for children who have emotional and behavioral disabilities, is in peer environments where peers are not able to respond to them in a healthy manner. A, they are more likely to be bullied, but B, people may also do things that will set them off and then reinforce negative behaviors on their part rather than positive behaviors. Similar who are in an inclusive environment have to also be able to be their own social and emotional competencies so that they can be more inclusive, so that they can, for example, be self-aware and be self-aware regarding how their own may lead them to interact with the person in a particular way, may lead to certain behaviors are not productive for the person, may tend to limit opportunities to learn. And so just to give you one example, we know from studies that were done in special classes for kids with emotional behavioral disorders, and what I'm about to say could be replicated in inclusive classes, that teachers, when kids are behaviorally problematic, teachers are less likely to call on them. They give them less wait time. They give them less self-awareness, which is part of social and emotional competency, can help teachers to do that. So it's all those different things together that end up helping to support more inclusive environments. And through those environments, help people develop their own social and emotional competence. Next slide, Elizabeth. Last year, I was at a Capitol Hill briefing right the day that the march began regarding the school shootings that had taken place in Florida. And on the panel of researchers, there was also a student from Parkland, and she was talking about the need for more investments in social emotional learning and not just investments in police. And I want to unpack the logic of what she was saying. Violence has multiple causes, and while some people who are violent are people who have mental illness, other people who are violent are not. Certainly when people use expressive violence, they are in some ways acting in ways that they are out of control, and social and emotional skills can help them not get to the point that they are out of control. And that what we know from 3 decades of research and syntheses is that people who are likely to become more violent often display warning signs early that can be used for supportive interventions, not for controlling interventions. And among those warning signs are signs regarding people's inability to self-regulate, inability to self-manage, inability to understand how other people feel. Things that social emotional learning can address. And good social emotional learning programs are ones, both universally but also with more levels of intensity, that can help people address those types of risks that are related to the types of warning signs that are exhibited, which, if unaddressed, could get young people in trouble. At the same time, if we look at the roots of violence in schools and communities, it includes what has already happened to people when other people perpetrate different types of aggression on them, whether it's bullying, whether it's verbal abuse, whether it's emotional abuse, whether it is sexual abuse. And in different ways, both in the short and long run, social emotional learning for everybody in environments gives them skills so that they are less likely to bully and abuse other people, more likely to stand up to bullying and other types of abusive behaviors when they see some indicator of it, more able to support somebody who has been victimized. And we know from research that if after victimization you were supported, the consequences are psychologically are less damaging than if you're not. And through all of that, not creating somebody who also has been so victimized and hurt and isolated by their victimization that they become more prone to antisocial violence. And then let me lastly add that social and emotional skills and competencies can be key part of restorative practices and key part of restorative justice, where instead of throwing people out of schools and agencies and communities, instead we enable them to better understand the consequences of their behavior and to learn to address their needs in different ways, as well as to make restitution in a way that the person who is hurt by them feels more comfortable. And that set of including processes, which are community building processes, are also more likely to head off violence. Next slide, Elizabeth.
Go ahead, David.
Okay, so this slide is about the what we know from syntheses of our best information on how children and youth develop and grow. That comes from work across many disciplines. And ultimately, while it was done by a few people, myself included, who are not expert in all those disciplines, it was vetted by people in those disciplines. That I think what is probably most important is that while some people in the past felt that social and emotional and cognitive processes were separate, we now know that at a structural level, at a electrical level, at a chemical level, as well as at an emotional and thoughtful level, social and emotional cognitive processes are linked. What we also now know is that there is, due to neuroplasticity and epigenetic processes, that development is malleable. Not only are genes not determinative alone, it really is the expression of the genes in environments and what is, which genes end up being utilized and which are not. But in addition, there really is an ability for there to be a good deal of adaptability, and includes the ability of people to successfully recover from trauma. That malleability also includes the fact that people are involved both individually and collectively in making sense of their experiences. And that perhaps most importantly, what we know is that the learning process, both the learning process academically, but the learning process to be a human being, to be healthy, to not be violent, to connect, to be someone who not only is a good community member, but includes other people in your community, develops in social context. It develops in your relationships with other people. And when they are strong and affirming, you are more likely to develop in a healthy manner, and that includes to develop healthy social and emotional competencies. Next slide.
There was one more bullet point down there, David, that I missed when I was loading it, about variability being the norm.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Something came up. Oh, sure. Okay. All right. Know with more confidence, both mathematically, where we always should have known it, but now we're able to measure it, is that every human being is individual. Every human being makes their own pathway through life, even though we may end up in comparable places. And what that means is that it is as important as possible to not just be basing our decisions on what we know from data that is based on averages, but rather to get as nuanced as we can. It certainly means looking at disaggregation, but it really means going beyond simple disaggregation, say by demographic categories, because one of the things that defines our lives and experiences is intersectionality, is the fact that we walk through many places and experience them in different ways and are treated in different ways. And all those different things shape us. They shape us neurobiologically through that epigenetic process I mentioned before. They shape us in terms of the sense making we do, and that ultimately the best interventions are ones that both understand the fact that there are common things we have in common as human beings or as members of a particular cultural group or organizational space, but also that there really is a uniqueness to us. And that uniqueness, when harnessed, is very powerful. As I indicated before, we develop in contexts that are relationship rich, and that the ability of adults to attune to children and youth, to help children and youth and their adult peers by buffering stress, and to support in different ways their linked cognitive, social, and emotional development is key to learning and personalized learning and to healthy development. And what is particularly important here is that just as young people in their development are affected by who they're in contact with, so are the adults who provide support to young people, and so that we have to be at the same time that we are attentive to the support needs of young people. Just as adults are important in healthy development, so are peers, and peers are important as people who help other people co-regulate, as people who provide models for social learning and social reinforcements, and people who one may go to help one make sense of one's experiences. all of this, the relationships that people have, their ability to support each other, their both ability to be socially and emotionally competent, and their need for social and emotional learning supports to develop those competencies relate to the importance of stress in our lives. And for many people, stress is enhanced by trauma and other adversities that they experience, which, if not addressed in ways that can handle the consequences of stress, affect people in their physical health through things like inflammation. But we know from tracing the impacts of adverse childhood experiences into adulthood that it affects everything from obesity to cardiovascular risk. Stress affects one's mental well-being and wellness and ability to perform. And stress very much, both in the moment, affects your ability to learn, and over time has consequences in terms of less learning. And while on the one hand what we want to do is to reduce the causes of stress and eliminate the causes of adverse childhood experiences and other adversities, we need to know that people handle stress and adversity and trauma better as a whole. Individuals again vary, but they handle it better when they have the support of others. Margaret Beale Spencer talks about net risk, net adversity, and what she means by that is what we should be looking at is not just whether or not there is a risk in somebody's environment, but whether there is something in that environment, but also avert or buffer the consequence of the risk, because if that is the case, then the net adversity from that risk is zero. And what we know more and more is that from the science of learning work, as well as 30 years of work on resilience, is that resilience, but also now I add thriving, is possible. And what's very important is that even though as individuals we may have characteristics that help us be more resilient, resilience is not an individual phenomenon, even though we measure it individual. It is something that exists in relationship to other people and through the support of other people that enable people to be resilient, particularly over the life course. And what we also know, given some of your concerns with health, is the ability to demonstrate resilience and be resilient does not mean that there still may not be some longer-term health consequences that happens when you have encountered adversities that have affected you.
Next slide. I think we're at the pause for questions.
That's what I thought too. Okay, great.
Oh.
Okay, and let me just apologize again for whatever happened while I kept on getting kicked off. Okay.
Right. And I think we'll make this brief because of where we are on the clock. But does anyone have any clarifying questions for David?
Elizabeth, there is one on the message board asking if there's a scholarly article that stresses the point about going beyond simple disaggregation.
Yes. All right. It's two things. One is I'm going to give you both a scholarly article that that actually is a link you had. If you look at the Cantor et al. Article, there is a section on individuality. And one of the 5 authors of the Cantor article, it's called Malleability and Plasticity, is Rose, called Beyond the Average. And there is also, and I can send this to people because it's probably it's not one of the links I gave you. I gave is that there are a series of 10 commentaries on the 250 and by who's a adult scientist and who he was helpful. Basically, and we talk about is that there really is a jaggedness to learning and development, and whenever you start measuring people at an individual level, you start seeing this. And that the other basic point is that if you think about it, if you address it mathematically, while we can develop an average, no one person may necessarily be that average. And when we develop interventions that are based on the average, we are not necessarily developing interventions that really are responsive to the variety of unique individuals who ultimately contribute to that average. And in the same way that scientific analyses that are based on, that are variable centered and just look at changes in averages are not really sensitive to a good deal of individual change.
And David and others, I posted the page, the web link that will take you to the session description. We'll also have the recording of this session, but also any additional citations that David and Elizabeth would like to add. I'll make sure they're in that session description.
Great,
Elizabeth?
Thank you, Doug.
Yeah.
Okay, if there are no other questions, and we'll have some more time for questions at the end, we'll just keep moving. Yes?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that's
okay. So this section I'm going to talk about is just giving some people ideas about collaboration to create an enabling environment for the promotion of positive SEL. A lot of what I'm going to say is overlapping with system development in general, whether you're developing early childhood education systems or health systems or whatever. But here I'm going to take it through just in the context of thinking about it for promoting SEL. Because as I think was clear from the diversity of people that are on this call and what David was talking about, it's not just the responsibility of schools or parents or something like that. And for young people to really get that supportive environment that develops SEL really is a cross-sector effort. So thinking about the systems, when I talk about systems, you have to think both the vertical alignment within systems, so it's sort of thinking from top to bottom of systems. It could be mental health providers, law enforcement, education systems, things like that. Do things get from the top level in terms of values, planning, and all that to what actually happens on the ground with young people? And then there's horizontal alignments between health, between education, things like that. There's a great example of some alignment I see in my community between systems where the local newspaper, they used to just have Athlete of the Week. That was it for young people. And now they started having Student of the Week. And it's supported by the local health foundation. And they collaborate with the school. And in the school, the teachers identify kids to be Student of the Week. And it is not the star student typically. They talk about how this student helps others, how maybe, their special education work is very challenging, but they work so hard and they've progressed so well this year, or they listen so well to the teacher, or they work so well in a group. And those are the kinds of things that are in the paper for the Student of the Week. And it's a great example of collaboration between the schools. It makes the teachers pay attention to those things, to identify the students and catch them doing great things around social emotional learning. The health center people, take that information and share it with the newspaper, and then that shares it with the community. So I think that's a great, just small example of this kind of collaboration around supporting SEL. So it doesn't always have to be some giant public policy thing, although that's great. It could be on that kind of level as well. So one thing that's really important is this understanding that SEL is not something that's just given to young people, but rather developed with young people, and that people understand that all the adults and peers around a young person have a role to play. It's not just something that they do at that school activity or something like that, or that coach works on with them or something. So that's something that you can't assume everybody involved in this kind of effort, if you're trying to do some collaboration, that they have that understanding. So that's something important to develop, that shared understanding, what we're learning about the advances in neuroscience that David talked about how kids affect their environment and are not just affected by their environment, and how that interplay works. Then there's a need for common terminology and a shared understanding of meaning across and within systems. There are a lot of words for a lot of the things we do, character education, moral education, social emotional learning. There are all these different terms and things. So developing and it's not that there's one right way to frame things, but the people involved do need some shared understanding of kind of what they're talking about. Developing shared intrinsic goals for children and youth that require or reflect good SELs. And when intrinsic goals are really the end point. Children and youth are healthy. Children and youth make good decisions in their lives. Children and youth look out for their peers and become good members of the community. Those are intrinsic goals. Why are we even doing all of this? What do we want out of all of this? Then there's also been developing shared instrumental goals. What do child and youth serving systems or entities need to do to work towards these intrinsic goals? A lot of times just having these conversations can be extremely useful in terms of building people's capacity, understanding, getting people on the same page. Regardless of, it's nice if there's some big formal system-wide plan, but if that's not where you are, even just having these kinds of conversations between, say, education and health systems, or between behavioral health and justice systems, these kinds of conversations can be extremely useful. Then, if you can keep going and if you can really work on systems, it's really good to, once you have your intrinsic and instrumental goals, conduct a situational analysis. Where are you? Where are the gaps between the policies that you need to have and things like financing, again, whether it's public financing or someone to pay to put that great thing in the newspaper, collaboration, leadership, programming, monitoring and evaluation, public demand, where are there gaps, and then also where are there gaps in misalignment between different systems and levels within systems. How much are people already on the same page and working together, and where are there gaps in that, either again vertically or horizontally. Something's a policy, but it doesn't reach the ground. Great things are happening on the ground, but the people doing it on the ground don't get the support from above to make it sustainable. Where are those gaps? Then looking at that, so you have your goals, you have your understanding of where you are now, then ideally you develop some kind of an action plan that will take you from where you are to where you want to be. And then using monitoring and evaluation to see if your implementation of your action plan is taking place as you intend. To what extent are your instrumental goals being achieved? Like all children, maybe an instrumental goal will, all youth learn about nutrition and exercise. That's an instrumental goal to achieve physical health. To what extent is that kind of goal being achieved? To what extent does doing that then drive the desired outcome? So we're doing all this programming in the community on nutrition and exercise, to what extent is that driving change in children's nutrition and physical activity levels, right? And ultimately health. And then are there unintended consequences? There could be good unintended consequences, bad unintended consequences, or emerging needs. So, sort of stopping and reflecting on that road between where you are and where you want to be. That monitoring and evaluation component is also very important as well. So I'm going to stop there because we only have 5 minutes left on the clock, 6 minutes. I know we threw a huge amount of information, so I will end there and open it up for discussions and questions.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and just to reassure folks, we'll continue with the conversation as long as it's lively. We need not be ruled by the clock, so if people do have questions or comments, please just click on your mic to say to use your audio, or type them into the message box, and I'll read them out as they're posted. And I encourage you to just click on your mic and say hello, and then ask your question or make your comment. I had one while we're starting, and it goes to one of the core functions of the working group that the Fresh Partnership is engaged in is trying to look at how much of these kinds of broad, very important paradigms can be absorbed in school systems. I really like the discussion at the end about systems, because we need to think about how much can be absorbed by school systems in different contexts even. So, and one of the first things we did was to look at how much time is available to teach in a formal classroom setting, and it's not the only vehicle, to teach about health and life skills, or as we call it, health and personal and social development. And how many hours of instruction that are truly available, let alone how much is truly delivered. And so that the finite limits, as Elizabeth talked about, intrinsic goals and instrumental goals and sort of outputs at the end of primary school, the end of secondary, what's really achievable. And I think that's a challenge for these concepts. And so if Elizabeth or David, if you want to comment about how do we translate this into day-to-day real-world practice.
I'd be happy to, Doug. While a lot of the evidence that was first developed on social and emotional learning was based on intervention programs that were delivered as curricula and took a finite amount of space, is moving. And I would be happy to send additional links regarding this, is in two ways that actually make it easier. And while I'm going to use the example of schools, this can also be relevant in other settings as well. One of the two is being clear that when you create an emotionally safe and supportive environment where the adults model and embody social and emotional competence and are able to connect to young people. This is the normal business. We don't do this normal business well, but the normal business, not anything in it extra. That in itself creates the conditions where people end up starting to develop and realize and test out their social and emotional competence. The second piece is, instead of trying to just do SEL as a standalone program, instead to integrate it into the activities that are already going on in the classroom or the setting. In the classroom, to use perspective taking as part of the discourse and conversation when young people are discussing literature in whatever their culture is. In other settings, integrating the support and development of social and emotional competency into group activities. You have to be intentional about it. You may want to spend some time assessing it, but you don't have to do separate programs in order to do this type of work. It really is the environment and the way in which people interact, as long as there is an intentionality, particularly among those who are shaping the environment, those who are more influential formally in the environment because they are the adults, to really implement those skills. I know from my work, and some of it's been with Elizabeth, and I think she knows from her work, that that's one of the ways that one can integrate social emotional learning in places like Bangladesh, but it's also in places like the United States. And so it does not actually have to be an extra burden.
Also, I would add, in relation to the enabling environment, I did another fresh webinar in one of the other series back in July, talking about the interplay between neurobiology, coping, and all that in the classroom environment. That would also carry over to coaches, to people in the community and all that. So if anyone wants to go back and look at the webinar or the slides from that, I gave some of that information back in July, and some of that may be relevant here.
Certainly. Thank you, Elizabeth.
So Doug, just to summarize, I think it's really important that for us try to find things that are not just another framework, because another framework is going to die in schools and other settings. I think the thing is to find a framework that actually is sensible, not just because it works, but rather also because it really is integratable into the ongoing work and expectation of an environment already, and it becomes then an enhancement, not just an addition.
Thank you for that comment. I agree. I think one of the challenges we have in health and social development education is that there are so many paradigms or frameworks or health topics that schools become bombarded, and so certainly our working group is not going to have not going to try to recommend frameworks, but rather a menu of good paradigms that they can build from, use in their own planning. But they've got to decide what is more relevant to them, and that's and also try to boil it down into what's achievable within a given context, and that's the challenge that I think will require further research. It's not going to be something that the Fresh Working Group can do, but researchers like yourself and others who are working on these issues can certainly take us down those pathways to make it work, make it more practical. I see Janelle from UNESCO is online, and thank you, Janelle, for that comment. We will definitely be the recording will be posted on the web page that is showing up in the message box above. I had another question around going across subject areas. I know I'm coming back to not so much teaching, capital S, capital E, capital L, but rather how this can be integrated into other subject areas, obviously health and life skills being one of them. And rather than just giving an example, which has been noted in the research, that you can teach SEL through examples in literature, but is there a mapping that can be done for those? If you take a typical language arts curriculum and point out opportunities where SEL can be emphasized, can we build those kinds of maps?
Yeah. Yes, you can build those kinds of maps, and I think what I would just add is you can both, and people have done them for certain types of curricula already in certain particular areas and school districts, I've seen them. What I would add is if one wants, there is the tactical map, which is really, or the sort of grand tactical map, which is mapping how you can make those curricular connections in the day, etc. There's also the strategic mapping, what are the underlying skills that you're trying to develop in a particular area, and how do they relate to social and emotional competence? So, for example, a key social and emotional competence that relates to a key cognitive competence is what we call metacognition. And it's not just something we use in schools, it's something we use in all the settings. And the ability to be metacognitive is a social, emotional, as well as cognitive ability. And it underpins learning in any particular discipline. But the way in which you are metacognitive in a particular discipline is disciplinary specific. Or one of the things that we know is that if we want to promote deeper learning for all children, is that we have to create the conditions where they can get involved in academic struggle and can learn from failure and not just from success. And again, I think social emotional competencies are important insofar as they enable young people to more adeptly engage in frustration and come out of it through learning, through that academic struggle, and at the same time to better equip teachers with the ability to, get through their own emotions and attune to young people, so teachers can better understand what Vygotsky called the zone of proximal development. How far a young person can move with support. And so what I'm saying here, Doug, is that A, you can do that mapping. It's actually very possible. I've seen it done. But B, what is perhaps even more important are these foundational skills that teachers would want to keep on going back to, like metacognition, like the ability to stop and think and reflect, that are both cognitive enhancements but are also socially and emotionally important.
Great. I'll come back to that. But Jappy, you have a question. Please go ahead.
Hi. First of all, thanks everybody for this. It's fantastic. I have a question regarding whether you might have specific recommendations in terms of staffing ratios, in particular for young children. And a bit of background to the question. So I recently finished my PhD exploring the well-being impacts of eating environments in early childhood care settings. I'm in Toronto, Canada, and we have great regulation in the childcare settings and nothing whatsoever actually in the school setting. And in one of my groups in the school setting, there was a small group of kindergarten age children, about 3 or 4, where there were 3 children who happened to be going through traumatic life events, and there was one teacher. And she was fantastic. She started the day outdoors, did a lot of experiential learning, was very good at having the kids, one of them was very nature focused, and she set up a aquarium in the classroom, etc. But she was one person, and there's no staffing regulations. And my work is sort of policy oriented. So I'm wondering if you might have recommendations of specifically well-being in classroom settings and ways to support that with staffing ratios.
I'll jump in on that one because my other hat, and actually most of my work is around early childhood.
Okay.
It's a bit of a complicated question. I was working on one project where one component, somebody from a partner organization went to look at the early childhood center at a refugee camp, and the ratio was 300 to 1. That's never okay. Not possible. So, it really is an interplay of, like you mentioned, teacher skills. 3 children may be overwhelming for one person, and 10 children is fine for another.
So there's 20 kids in the class, but 3 high need. So basically the other 17 were on their own.
Yeah, I mean, some of it's kind of what the system can do. I mean, can the system really split that into 2 classes? Probably not, based on budget. But, a lot of times having a trained classroom aide can be a way to adjust the ratio thing without needing to hire, full-time teachers. So that can certainly help. There's also, depending on the context, giving especially children that have some extra needs, some opportunities for one-on-one time with other adults in the school. It could be, it doesn't have to be a quote-unquote guidance counselor or something like that, but sometimes maybe, if they find the classroom overwhelming, having a little one-on-one time with, the nice lady in the nurse's office or something to settle down when they're getting overwhelmed, things like that. So there are certainly also strategies you can do that kind of improve the ratio if you're not able to actually hire more teachers. And then also there's things, any individual teacher can only do so much no matter how skilled they are. But, the more, there's a lot of resources out there for creating trauma-informed classrooms. Right. And to the extent that the teacher can do that sort of thing, it will make it easier for that teacher to manage. Like we know children who are struggling, who've had traumatic experiences, do much better if there's predictable routines. All kids do better with predictable routines, but they're especially sensitive to things like predictable routines in the classroom. And so there are things that teachers can do to kind of help themselves to help the children do well in class. But I would sort of think about kind of all the different ways you could get more supportive adults to collaborate with that teacher in the absence of being able to, split the class into 2 groups of 10 or something like that.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, we normally actually have 30 to 2. Just smaller classes could have 20 to 1, and this one was. Children were getting attacked. It was stressful.
Yes, and that is definitely a situation where, children who've experienced trauma, and youth, and adults, who've experienced traumatic experiences, both have more difficulty functioning in their school or their job training or their workplace or whatever. They both have more difficulty coping and are more likely to engage in behaviors because they're having difficulty coping that kind of rile up everybody else. Yeah. And then sort of amp up the whole classroom. If you have kids that can't manage their behavior, they amp up the whole classroom. We know every class has some kids that are going to have difficulties, some kids that are going to handle themselves pretty well no matter what, and then there's that group that are kind of on the edge, and they're not going to stand up in their chair and jump off it unless the kid next to them is doing it. And so, certainly also the kids who've had those kinds of difficulties have more difficulty coping, and then a lot of times will engage in behaviors that kind of set off everybody else, or make it more complicated for the teacher and kind of amp up the whole class, and you can get into kind of the negative cycle. Yeah. So it can also be very useful, again, looking at some of those trauma-informed resources, which a lot of things are freely available, for teachers to kind of recognize when those things are starting to happen and developing their own coping skills to be able to think well, keep themselves calm, help those children to kind of self-regulate however that happens, and keep it from spilling over into a negative cycle with the teacher getting upset and frustrated and not making good decisions, and the other children also sort of getting upset and not coping well, and then the whole classroom's kind of in a spiral.
Elizabeth, if I can add that I think that this connects back to the earlier part of the presentation about the relationship between SEL and inclusion. I mean, that ultimately what you really want is to create environments that are psychologically safe for everybody, where people don't set each other off, where people are able to respond much more to people who are at higher levels of need, both by not setting them off in the first place, but by being able to be more ably responsive afterwards. And I think the more we can combine trauma sensitivity and a concern with the development and elaboration of social emotional competence within safe and supportive environments as one piece, the more effective we are, and actually the more easily we're addressing the concern that Doug had raised before about too many things coming in. These are the same skills.
Absolutely.
These
Thank
are
you.
the same needs.
It gives a nice opportunity for a bit of an advert for one of the sessions. Next Tuesday, we're going to be looking at social inclusion with the fellow Paul Downs, who has done a lot of work for the European Commission, setting up systems thinking and policy issues around the structures that need to be in place, and it would include staffing, as you know, what kind of resources to the different systems not only schools need to be able to be effective in social inclusion strategies. And so that's part of the reality check I'm hoping that the Fresh Working Group can at least identify, not to solve, but at least identify and point the way towards the kind of data collection, not necessarily research about what is available. I'm always impressed by the work in the U.S., although I know it's under budgetary crisis pressure, that they're able to track through the SHIP study, the School Health and Policy Program Survey, that they're able to identify what resources do exist at a systems level. And that's the kind of thinking we need to bring to this, so the burden is not just on the teacher or they're not focused on changing kids, but also changing systems around them. I'm going to look towards finishing up and see if we have any other questions from folks on the line. The recording, as I said, will be posted along with the slides and additional citations on that fresh-partners.org website. Just giving you a final chance to ask a question before we close up. Again, thank you coming from different participants online. Maybe I'll take that as a cue. And David and Elizabeth, thank you very much. I really like the flow of the presentation, of starting with some very thoughtful, in-depth thinking about the science of it, underlying social emotional learning, and then working, closing off with a look at the systems, because I think we need that, both really in-depth micro analysis as well as the macro capacity kind of discussions that we started to have at the end of the session. So thank you again for a very thoughtful and in-depth presentation and discussion. And these thoughts will be going into a what we're calling a concept note, so people can to have a second run at this. We'll be posting the concept notes as they come out during the Fresh Working Group. If you want to follow that, again, look to the Fresh Partners website and look under activities, and you'll find the working group notes there. There'll be updates periodically on that working group page. Our next session is quite immediate. We're doing a session on Thursday looking at digital and media literacy. Again, a different real world. It's not only virtual, it's real as well in terms of its impact. And we have presentations coming from a media literacy group in Canada, as well as an expert from Israel on health literacy and how it applies to media literacy. So that's starting at a slightly later hour. It's at 10 o'clock Washington, D.C. time on Thursday. And then the Tuesday session will be on social inclusion. So David and Elizabeth, any final thoughts and comments before we close up?
From David, again, my apologies for the fact that my system did not work and I kept on getting kicked off, but I think this has been very productive. I'm happy to help further. And my one other thought is only, and Doug, I'll send you a link, and I'm not trying to push a book, but that in terms of the systems connection, that there's a handbook came out this year that a bunch of us edited, that really is about the combination of a sort of SEL trauma-informed work, but at a system level. So I'll send you a link to it, Doug, yes, and you can decide. It's available as an ebook and by Kindle as well as other stuff.
Yes, please do send the reference. I'll be happy to add it. And
okay.
Yes,
Right.
You've got a popular follower of systems thinking here.
Oh, great.
Elizabeth?
Oh, I just want to say thank you to everybody for participating. We really appreciate being able to share a little bit that we know with you.
Great. Thank you again. So if folks could go to the upper right and click on that little X to exit the meeting room. We do keep the meeting in its essence going on, so we can still use the same URL. So please exit the meeting room, and thank you again for your comments. And I'll look to end the recording.